The first time my wife made a joke about me in front of our friends, everybody laughed, including me. That's the thing about humiliation when it comes wrapped in a smile. You don't always feel the bruise until later, when you're lying awake replaying the room and realizing you were the only one who thought it was harmless. My name's Caleb. I'm 37, I live outside Indianapolis, and until a certain point, I thought marriage could survive a lot as long as both people still respected each other. Stress, money problems, dry spells, family drama, all of that can be worked through. But once respect starts rotting in public, once your wife gets a little too comfortable making you smaller in front of other people, something deeper is already breaking. Megan and I had been married for 8 years. No kids. Just the two of us in a decent split-level house with a finished basement, a backyard that needed more work than I ever had time for, and the kind of routines that used to make me feel grounded. I worked as a service manager for an auto repair chain. Long hours, grease under the nails even when I wasn't on the floor, steady paycheck, decent benefits. Megan worked in event marketing for a local hospitality group. She was good at it too. Quick with people, polished, always knowing what to say and how to say it. That had been one of the things I loved about her at the beginning. She could walk into any room and make it feel lighter. Back when we first got together, that light used to fall on me too. She used to brag about me, actually. Not in some fake over-the-top way. Just little things. She liked telling people I could fix anything. She liked that I was steady. That I didn't posture. That I showed up when I said I would. If we were out with friends and somebody asked how we met or what I did, she used to put a hand on my arm when she talked, like she was proud there was history between us. Somewhere along the way, that changed. At first, it was subtle enough to shrug off. A joke here and there about how predictable I was. A comment about how I lived by routine. She'd roll her eyes when I wanted to leave somewhere before midnight and say I was already turning into somebody's father. People would laugh, and I'd laugh too, because none of it sounded cruel on the surface. It sounded like regular marriage teasing. Normal couple stuff. But then the jokes got sharper. Not all at once. That would have been easier to call out. No, they got sharper in increments, like she was testing what kind of disrespect the room would tolerate if she delivered it with enough charm. One Friday night, we were at dinner with two other couples, friends we'd known for years. We were talking about vacations, and one of the women mentioned a spontaneous weekend trip she and her husband took without planning anything. Megan snorted into her wine glass and said I'd never do that because I needed everything scheduled down to the bathroom break. Everybody laughed. I smiled and kept eating. Later, driving home, I told myself she was just being funny. Another time, we had people over to watch a game. Somebody was talking about confidence, that whole dumb conversation men fall into after a couple beers, and Megan said I looked confident until it was time to make an actual move on anything. Then she gave me this sideways smile like the room should understand more than she was saying. They did. I could tell from the reaction. The half-laughs. The glances. The kind of silence that means people heard something personal slip out and aren't sure whether to pretend they didn't. I let that one go too. That's the part I still revisit sometimes. All the times I let it go. I think I did it because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't take a joke. I didn't want to look insecure, especially not in front of her. Once a woman starts pushing at your dignity in public, your instinct is to protect what's left of it by staying calm. You tell yourself calling it out would only make it uglier. So you swallow it. Then you swallow the next one too. Meanwhile, things at home were changing in ways I didn't know how to talk about without sounding pathetic. The intimacy had started fading months before the public jokes got bad. Not disappearing overnight, just thinning out until every attempt at closeness felt like I was interrupting something. She was tired. She had a headache. She had an early meeting. She felt bloated. She wasn't in the mood. Every marriage goes through seasons, so I tried not to make it about me. But there's only so many times a man can reach for his wife and feel her body go politely unavailable before it starts to chip something off him. Megan also stopped touching me casually. No hand on my shoulder walking past. No leaning against me on the couch. No absent-minded brushing of my arm when she talked. The body language between us changed before the words did. I noticed that. I just didn't want to honor what it might mean. The weird part was she didn't seem generally unhappy. That's what made me second-guess myself for longer than I should have. She still had energy. Still laughed with her friends. Still dressed up for work events and girls' nights and looked alive doing it. She just seemed bored with me. Not angry. Bored. Like marriage had turned me into furniture she knew was useful but no longer really saw. Then summer came, and with it a run of birthdays, barbecues, rooftop drinks, All those social things people in their 30s still force themselves to do to prove they have a life outside work. That was when I really started noticing how relaxed she seemed when I was the punchline. She never attacked me directly. That's what made it hard to defend myself without sounding dramatic. She'd just say something a little too personal, a little too cutting, in a tone that gave her room to claim she was only teasing if I pushed back. But when a wife jokes about her husband long enough in front of the same circle, the room learns something. It learns he's safe to diminish. It learns she doesn't mind if he's the one absorbing the discomfort. One night in August, we were at our friends Lauren and Pete's house for drinks on the patio. Nothing wild. String lights overhead, music low, too much hard seltzer, people pretending they still had the stamina for late nights. At some point the conversation turned toward marriage advice, which always turns stupid after enough alcohol. Somebody asked what the secret was to surviving the 7-year itch. Megan laughed and said probably low expectations. Then she glanced at me and added that disappointment hurt less when you had already built in a cushion. That one landed hard. People laughed because they didn't know what else to do. I laughed too, because again, what were my options in that moment? Sit there and explain to a patio full of buzzed adults that my wife's contempt was starting to bleed through the jokes? I just took a drink and stared out into Pete's backyard like there was something worth studying in the fence line. On the drive home, I asked her why she said stuff like that. She acted confused at first, then annoyed. Said I was too sensitive lately. Said everybody knew she was kidding. Said if I wasn't so defensive, maybe things wouldn't feel so personal all the time. That was the first time I remember feeling not just hurt, but rearranged. Because now it wasn't only that she could humiliate me in public. It was that she had built herself an escape hatch too. Any reaction I had became proof that I was the problem. Humorless. Insecure. Too fragile to handle her personality. After that, I got quieter. Not weaker. Just quieter. I started paying more attention at parties. More attention to who she sat near, who she lit up around, who she got a little too comfortable performing for. I noticed that when she embarrassed me, she usually glanced around the room first. Not to see if I was okay. To see who was watching. Who might appreciate the line. Who might reward it. And then came the night everything changed shape. It was mid-September, a Saturday, one of those warm nights that tricks you into thinking summer still has a little time left. We were at a friend's birthday downtown, a crowded bar with exposed brick, overpriced drinks, and too many people packed close together. Megan had been drinking faster than I had. Not falling down drunk, just loose enough to stop editing herself. I was standing near the bar waiting on another round when I looked across the room and saw her laughing with a guy I recognized vaguely from somewhere in her work orbit. He had one hand braced on the high-top table behind her. She was leaning in closer than she needed to hear him. And the smile on her face wasn't the smile of a wife making harmless conversation. It was familiarity. Not full-blown betrayal. Not yet. But familiar enough that my stomach dropped before my brain had a chance to explain why. Then she touched his chest while she laughed at something he said, and I realized with this sick, steady clarity that the disrespect had not been random. It had been making room for something. I didn't confront her at the bar. That's probably the part some people would judge first. They'd think if you see your wife leaning too close to another man, touching his chest, smiling like she forgot you existed 5 feet away, then you're supposed to storm over there and make the room acknowledge what just happened. Maybe some men would. Maybe a younger version of me would have wanted to. But standing there with 2 sweating glasses in my hand, watching Megan laugh up at him like she had known him longer than I had been led to believe, all I felt was this slow cold certainty that a public explosion would only help her. She was already too comfortable turning me into a spectacle. I wasn't going to hand her another scene where I looked insecure and she looked misunderstood. So I walked back to the table. I set her drink down in front of the empty stool she'd left behind and sat there by myself, surrounded by birthday noise and bad music and people who had no idea my marriage had just tilted harder than it ever had before. I kept my eyes on the room without staring directly at her. Every few seconds I'd catch another glimpse. The guy was tall, dark blazer, the kind of clean-cut confidence that reads polished even when a man's just wearing expensive casual. He looked to be around our age. Maybe a little older. Not movie star handsome. Just comfortable in his own skin. And that bothered me more than it should have. Because comfortable men are dangerous when your wife has started treating your steadiness like weakness. When Megan finally came back, she slid onto the stool beside me like nothing had happened. She picked up her drink, took a sip, and asked if I had remembered to ask the bartender for less ice this time. No acknowledgement of how long she'd been gone. No mention of the guy. No look that said maybe she knew she had drifted too far too long, too easily, just to complain about the drink. I asked who he was. She glanced over casually, saw who I meant, and said, "Oh, that's Trevor. He does vendor partnerships for one of the venues we use." Too fast. Too smooth. Like the answer was already waiting. I asked how she knew him. She shrugged and said through work, the way someone says through traffic or through weather. Basic. Unimportant. Then she added that he was funny, which for some reason landed harder than if she'd called him attractive. Funny meant she enjoyed him. Funny meant he reached a version of her that had been locked away from me for months. I said she seemed to be having a great time talking to him. That got me a look. Small, but sharp. Then she smiled in that dangerous way she had started doing more often, the smile that told me she was about to turn any discomfort I had into my flaw. "Relax," she said. "You look like I got caught with a boyfriend." Then she laughed. And because the room was loud and everybody was drinking and nobody around us was paying enough attention, she got away with saying exactly the kind of thing a wife shouldn't say unless some part of her enjoyed seeing what it did to her husband's face. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her. For 1 second, I think she realized she had pushed too far. Not because she felt guilty. Because I didn't rush to soften it for her. I didn't smile. Didn't roll my eyes. Didn't play the part of the easygoing husband who could absorb another one of her sharp little public performances. She looked away first. That mattered. The rest of the night got blurrier around the edges, not because I was drunk but because once something finally reveals its outline, your brain starts retrofitting the past. Everything Megan said after that sounded thin. Every time she laughed with someone else, I found myself checking whether Trevor was nearby. Every time she touched my arm or leaned in to say something, it felt belated. Functional. Like she was maintaining appearances more than reconnecting. We left a little after midnight. The drive home was quiet in the way all our drives home had become quiet, except this time the silence felt less like distance and more like a standoff. Streetlights kept flashing across the windshield. Megan kicked off her heels in the passenger seat and scrolled her phone for most of the ride, face lit pale blue by the screen. I kept both hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead because I knew if I looked at her too long, I was either going to say something I couldn't take back or ask a question she'd twist into another reason I was failing her. She broke the silence first. She asked if I was seriously upset about Trevor. Not about the way she talked to me. Not about the pattern. Not about months of contempt disguised as wit. Trevor. Like all of this could be reduced to one man in one bar on one night. I told her no. I was upset that my wife had gotten a little too comfortable humiliating me in public. That changed the air immediately. She straightened in her seat and said I was being dramatic. Said she was just talking. Said if I couldn't handle her having a normal conversation with a man from work, that was my issue. Then she pulled out the familiar weapon and used it like muscle memory. She said maybe I was so bothered because I knew she'd been right lately when she joked about me being uptight. There it was again. That turn. Every injury became a defense for her. Every defense became an accusation against me. I asked if she hurt herself when she talked to me like that. She laughed once, but there was no warmth in it. Then she said maybe if I stopped acting like I was under attack all the time, being around me wouldn't feel so exhausting. That sentence stayed with me longer than the rest of the drive. Not because it was the cruelest thing she had ever said. Because it was honest in a way the jokes had only hinted at. Exhausting. That was how she saw me now. Not husband. Not partner. A drain. A weight. Somebody she had to perform around until she could get back to people who felt lighter. When we got home, she went straight upstairs without another word. I stayed in the kitchen with the house dark around me, one hand on the back of a chair, replaying that moment at the bar over and over. Her hand on Trevor's chest. The way she leaned into him. The boyfriend joke. The total absence of hesitation. That wasn't a woman on the edge of a line. That was a woman who had already gotten used to walking near it. The next morning, she acted normal. That was somehow worse. She came downstairs in leggings and one of my old college sweatshirts, poured coffee, and asked if I could stop by the hardware store later because the back gate latch was sticking again. No acknowledgement of the argument. No apology. No softness. Just another task dropped into my hands like that was the most natural thing in the world after the night we'd had. I looked at her and realized something I should have admitted sooner. The disrespect was no longer occasional. It was structural. Built into the marriage now. Into the way she spoke to me, looked at me, used me as a prop for her charm in front of other people. And once I saw it that clearly, other things started surfacing too. She had been going into optional work events more often. Networking dinners, vendor mixers, Happy hours after campaigns wrapped. She used to tell me about those things in detail or invite me when partners were included. Lately, it was more vague. More last minute. More presented as routine, the kind of thing a husband is supposed to nod through because questioning it makes him insecure. I also started noticing that Trevor's name didn't stay isolated to that one night. Over the following week, Megan mentioned him twice, once in passing, saying Trevor had saved one of the event contracts from turning into a mess because a venue rep dropped the ball. Another time with a little more life in her voice, saying Trevor knew how to deal with difficult clients because he actually understood people. That line should have been harmless. Instead, the way she said understood people made me feel like she was talking around me, not to me. I kept my face neutral and asked if they worked together often. She said not really, just when events overlapped with his side of vendor logistics. Not really. That phrase bothered me because people use it when they want room to maneuver later. A few days after that, we had dinner at her friend Talia's place. Small group. 6 of us. Wine on the patio, grilled chicken, that whole suburban version of an easy night. Megan was in a good mood from the start. Too good, almost. Relaxed in that bright, social way she hadn't been with me in private for months. At one point Talia mentioned a downtown event coming up through Megan's company, and Megan said Trevor would probably be there because he was handling some of the venue coordination. Then Talia gave her this look. Quick. Tiny. But there. The kind of look women give each other when the room doesn't know what they know. It was gone almost immediately. Talia reached for her wine, changed the subject, and nobody else seemed to notice. But I noticed. Because once a husband starts feeling foolish in his own marriage, every side glance starts looking like a language you were never meant to learn. On the drive home that night, I asked why Talia reacted like that when she mentioned Trevor. Megan told me I was imagining things. I said I didn't think I was. She sighed, leaned her head against the window, and said I had been weird ever since the birthday bar. Then she added that if I was trying to make every man she worked with into a threat, maybe that said more about me than her. Again. Same move. Same escape hatch. But by then, it was getting harder to let her have it. Because this wasn't just about jealousy anymore. It was about a pattern that suddenly had a face attached to it. The public jokes. The contempt. The way she performed my inadequacy in front of people and then found lightness with a man who clearly enjoyed the contrast. I didn't confront her again that week. Instead, I watched. I watched how fast she picked up her phone when it buzzed during dinner. I watched how often she angled the screen away from me, even when I hadn't leaned in. I watched her come home from work events with that look women get when they're trying very hard to seem normal and not particularly thrilled by whatever just happened outside the house. And then on Friday night, I saw the first thing I couldn't explain away as tone or instinct or overthinking. Megan was in the shower. Her phone was on the bathroom counter, charging. I wasn't snooping. I was grabbing ibuprofen from the cabinet because my head had been pounding since late afternoon. But right as I reached for the bottle, the screen lit up. I only saw the preview for a second. That was enough. Still laughing about your husband joke. Your trouble. No name at first. Just the message. Then the contact line sharpened. Trevor. I stood there frozen, ibuprofen bottle in one hand, staring at the screen until it went dark again. And in that moment, every joke she had made at my expense stopped feeling random. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was foreplay wrapped in public humiliation. I didn't move for a full second after the screen went dark. Then I looked at myself in the mirror over the sink and barely recognized the expression on my own face. Not rage. Not yet. It was something colder than that. The kind of stillness a man hits when the thing he's been trying not to name finally steps out into the light and says its own name for him. Still laughing about your husband joke. Your trouble. That message changed everything because it gave the humiliation context. Up until then, Megan had room to hide behind tone. Behind alcohol. Behind that polished little shrug people use when they want to hurt you publicly and still claim they were only teasing. But now I knew those jokes weren't just reckless. They were being shared. Replayed. Enjoyed privately with the man she'd been getting too comfortable around. My embarrassment had become part of their chemistry. I put the ibuprofen back in the cabinet and stepped out of the bathroom before she got out of the shower. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I thought they'd be shaking. I thought I'd be halfway to kicking open a door or holding the phone out the second she stepped into the hallway. Instead, I went downstairs and sat in the dark living room. That was when the real investigation started. Not because I wanted to become that guy. The husband sneaking around, stitching together pieces of his own marriage like a detective on a bad cable show. But once you realize two people have been using your dignity as a shared joke, you stop worrying so much about seeming paranoid. Pride looks different after humiliation. I knew one thing immediately. If I confronted Megan with just that message, she'd twist it. She'd say Trevor was kidding. She'd say the whole thing was office banter. She'd make it about me looking at her phone. The truth would turn into a fight about method, and she'd walk away with a bigger piece of the ground. I was done giving her that. So I stayed quiet. The next morning, I acted normal. Not warm. Not cold. Just normal enough that she wouldn't feel a shift. I made coffee. Took the dog-eared coupon mailer off the counter and tossed it. Asked if she wanted eggs. She said no, she was meeting Talia for brunch later, and if I hadn't known better I might have missed the tiny note of calculation in the way she said it. Like she was checking whether I'd react. Whether I'd ask follow-up questions. Whether I still knew how to play the husband who noticed nothing unless it was said out loud. I didn't bite. I told her okay and kept wiping down the stove. That bought me time, and time was what I needed most. Over the next few days, I started keeping track. At first it was all in my head, but by Monday I was putting it in the Notes app on my phone while sitting in my truck before work. Dates. Times. Anything that stood out. Nights she came home lighter than she had left. Mentions of Trevor. Work events. Girls' nights. The jokes she made in public and who was around when she made them. Every little thing I had brushed off because any one detail, by itself, sounded too pathetic to care about. Together, they sounded like a map. I also started looking backward. That was the hardest part. Because once I stopped focusing only on Trevor, the whole marriage started rearranging itself into a timeline I should have respected much sooner. The intimacy fading first. Her contempt getting bolder second. The public mockery increasing right around the same time her work events became more frequent and less specific. Then Trevor entering the picture, not as the beginning of her disrespect, but as the person who rewarded it. He hadn't created the rot. He had simply become the audience for it. That distinction mattered to me. Because if I was going to understand what was happening, I needed to stop pretending one man had suddenly stolen a perfectly good wife. The truth was uglier. My wife had started tearing down my place in her mind before I ever learned his name. On Wednesday, I got my first real opening. Megan left her laptop open on the dining room table while she went to take a call upstairs. She usually carried it everywhere if she was working from home, which told me she was distracted enough not to think about it. I was in the kitchen rinsing a plate when I noticed the screen hadn't locked yet. I stood there for a second, arguing with myself. Then I walked over. It was her work email. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Vendor threads. Event timelines. Budget approvals. But the inbox search bar was already open, and all I had to do was type his name. Trevor. A thread came up immediately. Not dozens. Just enough. Most of it was work on the surface. Venue details. Guest counts. Last-minute changes. But between the official messages, there were little side comments. Little bends in tone. One email from him ended with, "Try not to scare the clients too much before Friday." Another from her replied, "No promises. Somebody has to keep the man nervous." That line hit differently knowing what he'd texted about her husband joke. I clicked another thread. It was from after one of the downtown mixers she told me ran late because of vendor cleanup. Trevor had written, "You owe me for surviving your death stare across the room tonight." Megan replied, "You liked it." I closed the laptop so fast it almost made noise. That still wasn't a full confession. Still deniable. Flirtation lives in that slippery space where people can pretend tone doesn't count if they get cornered. But by then, I wasn't looking for one magic smoking gun. I was looking for the shape of the thing. And the shape was getting clearer by the hour. They had a rhythm. Private language. Private replay. Private energy. And woven through all of it was me. Not directly all the time. But enough. Enough to know my role in whatever this had become was not simply husband she grew distant from. I was part of the contrast. The joke that made the spark brighter. That Thursday night, I did something I hadn't done before. I checked the joint credit card. We mostly used separate cards for personal stuff and one shared card for household expenses, dinners, gas, things like that. Megan had her own accounts too, but if she used the joint card for anything that crossed into our shared life, I'd see it. There it was. 2 charges I didn't recognize from the previous month. Same rooftop bar downtown. One on the night she told me she was stuck at a networking panel. Another on a Sunday afternoon she said Talia needed help figuring out centerpieces for some cousin's bridal shower. Could it still have been Talia? Sure. Technically. But by then the technical truth meant less to me than the emotional one. Megan had been building an alternate channel of herself, and every new detail showed me how deliberately she kept me boxed out of it. By Friday, the suspense wasn't whether something was happening. It was how far. Was this still emotional? Was it still flirtation with alcohol and plausible deniability? Or had I already become the husband everyone quietly knew was being played except me? That question kept me awake most of that night, and I was staring at the ceiling wondering how long a marriage can technically exist after respect is gone. At some point I turned my head and looked at her face in the dark. Familiar face. Woman I'd taken road trips with. Woman who used to lean her bare legs across mine on summer nights and laugh at dumb movies with me. It was all still there physically. Same jawline. Same freckles at the bridge of her nose. Same person. And yet I felt like I was sleeping next to somebody who had already stepped into a different story and just hadn't officially informed me yet. Saturday gave me the break I needed. Megan said she had to drop in at an event venue for a final walkthrough before next week's corporate fundraiser. She made a point of sounding annoyed by it, like work was intruding on her weekend. That stood out, because people are usually most careful with lies when they want them to sound inconvenient. She left around 3. I waited 15 minutes, grabbed my keys, and followed. I'm not proud of that. But I'm also not ashamed of it. There's a point where a man stops confusing passivity with dignity. By then, I had passed that point. The venue she named was downtown, but when I got near it, her car wasn't there. I circled once, twice, then pulled into a loading zone half a block away and checked the side streets. Nothing. That sinking feeling came back immediately. Not because I didn't know she might lie. Because I did. It was the ease of it that kept getting me. The way she could put a false destination in my hands like a receipt and trust I'd file it away without checking. I sat there for a minute thinking, then remembered the rooftop bar charge from the card statement. Same district. 4 blocks over. I drove there. Her car was parked in the garage across the street. That was when my pulse kicked hard for the first time in days. I parked 2 levels down and took the stairs to the street. The rooftop bar had an open elevator lobby beside the entrance, and from the sidewalk I could see enough of the upper patio through the glass panels and railing gaps to spot her within a minute. Megan was there. And so was Trevor. They weren't in a group. Not with clients. Not with vendors. Not with coworkers doing some quick site check before heading home. Just the two of them at a corner table with drinks, late afternoon sun hitting the side of her face, her body angled toward him in a way I hadn't seen her angled toward me in longer than I wanted to count. He said something. She laughed. Then she leaned in, touched his wrist, and stayed there a second too long. I stood on that sidewalk looking up at my wife under soft rooftop light, watching her give another man the flirtation that had been leaking into my marriage through jokes and contempt and little private messages, and suddenly I understood the sequence with brutal clarity. The affair had not started with sex. It had started with permission. Permission to mock me. Permission to minimize me. Permission to turn me into the lesser man in the story so that the next man felt like an upgrade before he ever had to earn it. And once I saw that, I knew the next thing I needed wasn't another clue. It was the moment she stopped being careful. I didn't go up to that rooftop bar. I wanted to. There was a part of me already halfway out of the car, already seeing the scene play out in my head. I'd walk up to the table. Megan would jolt like she'd seen a ghost. Trevor would stand too fast and try to rearrange his face into something harmless. I'd ask one clean question in front of both of them, and whatever they said next would decide the rest. But that wasn't what I did. Because by then, I understood something I should have understood months earlier. Public scenes were Megan's territory. That was where she had all the advantage. She knew how to manage a room. How to laugh off tension. How to make the man reacting look bigger than the thing he was reacting to. If I confronted her there, with drinks on the table and sunlight still soft on her skin and that man sitting across from her, she'd turn the whole thing into another story about how dramatic I was. No. I was done giving her public versions of me she could use. So I stayed in the car. I watched them for 28 more minutes. I know that because I checked the clock 3 times, like some part of me needed exact numbers to survive what I was seeing. They leaned in close. They smiled in that low, easy way people do when the rest of the world has gone pleasantly blurry around one conversation. At one point Megan reached across the table and tapped his hand with 2 fingers while she laughed, and he turned his palm over beneath hers like that kind of contact had already become normal. Then, just before they got up to leave, he said something that made her go still for half a second. Not stiff. Soft. She looked down, smiled to herself, then back up at him with this expression I had not seen directed at me in so long it felt like watching archival footage of my own marriage. Warm. Girlish, almost. Interested in a way that made the rest of the world look like background. And that was the reveal, really. Not a kiss. Not a hotel room. Not lipstick on a collar. The reveal was seeing my wife look at another man with the exact softness she had spent the last year starving out of our house. That was when the whole thing finally stopped being a suspicion about cheating and turned into something worse. Replacement. I didn't follow them after they left the bar. I didn't need to. I already knew enough. I drove home with both windows cracked because the air inside the truck felt wrong, like it had gone stale while I was sitting there watching my marriage from across the street. Traffic was light. People were out walking dogs, heading to dinner, moving through normal Saturday evening routines. I remember thinking how insulting normal life can feel when your private life has just changed shape forever. When I got home, I didn't pace. Didn't pour a drink. Didn't rehearse speeches. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. Megan came in a little after 6:30 carrying that same tote bag she always brought to work events. She looked good in that effortless way some women do after they've spent 2 hours being admired by the right person. Sunglasses pushed up in her hair. Lipstick still clean. Not one sign that she had just come from anything she intended to explain honestly. She saw me at the table and hesitated. Just slightly. Then she asked why I was sitting in the dark. I hadn't even realized I never turned the lights on. I told her I knew she hadn't been at the venue. That got her attention. She set the tote down more carefully than necessary and asked what I was talking about. Calm voice. Calm face. The first layer of the performance already in place. So I told her. I told her I went downtown. I told her car wasn't at the venue. I told her I found it at the garage across from the rooftop bar. I told her I watched her sit across from Trevor like she had been waiting all week to get there. Everything in her face changed then. Not guilt first. Calculation. That was the part that hurt most. Even with the truth sitting right there between us, her first instinct was still to figure out what version of it she could survive with. She said it wasn't what I thought. I actually laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because some lies are so automatic they expose more than a confession ever could. I asked her what exactly I was supposed to think after months of public jokes about my masculinity, private messages with that man about my humiliation, and now rooftop drinks she lied about on a Saturday afternoon. Her mouth tightened when I said messages. That was when she realized how much I knew. She asked if I had gone through her phone. I told her no. I told her phone had lit up in front of me and Trevor's message had said enough on its own. She looked away after that. Toward the sink. Toward the hallway. Anywhere but me. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since the bar weeks earlier. I asked if the disrespect had started because of Trevor, or if Trevor just happened to enjoy it once she started. That landed. She sat down slowly across from me and for the first time in a long time, Megan looked like a woman who had run out of the right tone to use. What came out of her after that was messy and ugly and, in its own way, more honest than anything she'd said in months. She said Trevor made her feel seen. Said things between us had felt dead for a while. Said the jokes were never supposed to become this, said it started as flirting, as release, as somewhere to put the frustration she felt at home. She said she didn't realize how bad it sounded until I repeated it back. That was a lie, of course. She knew exactly how it sounded. That was why she only said those things in rooms where she thought she could control the reaction. Then I asked if it had gotten physical. She didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. But after a few seconds, she nodded. Once, she said. Then after another silence, she admitted it was more than once. A few weeks. Maybe a month. Long enough that all those jokes, all that contempt, all those public little cuts had already become part of an active betrayal. Long enough that I had been sitting at patios and parties laughing along while my wife and another man were building private language out of my humiliation. That was the strongest emotional blow of all. Not just that she cheated. That she used me to season it. Every time she mocked me in front of people, every time she made me look smaller, more hesitant, less manly, she wasn't just disrespecting me. She was creating the contrast that made Trevor feel bigger. Sharper. More exciting. My embarrassment had become part of their chemistry before I even knew there was a there. I remember standing up from the table very slowly because suddenly sitting there felt unbearable. Megan started crying then. Real crying, I think. Or real enough. She said she was sorry. Said she let things go too far. Said she had been angry and restless and stupid. Said it was never supposed to blow up our marriage. But by then, the marriage she was talking about already felt like a museum exhibit. Something that had once existed but could no longer be touched without alarms going off. I told her we were done. No big speech. No threats. No bargaining. Just done. The aftermath moved quickly after that because there wasn't much left to negotiate emotionally. Megan stayed with her sister that night. Then longer. There were the usual talks after. Divorce attorney. House logistics. Who gets what? When friends start learning the cleaned-up version first, then the uglier one underneath. Trevor disappeared from the story fast once consequences showed up, which told me everything I needed to know about him too. The marriage ended more quietly than the humiliation that poisoned it. And looking back, the affair wasn't actually the first thing that broke us. It was the moment my wife started enjoying my disrespect before someone else ever touched her.